An unusual chill settled over the village of Millhaven, Massachusetts, where the cobblestone streets seemed to drink in the pale morning light and keep it prisoner until dusk. The townspeople moved through their routines with the mechanical precision of a small New England community. Yet beneath their neighborly smiles and polite greetings lingered a heaviness in the air, a tension that no one dared name aloud. Children who once shrieked with laughter in the commons now clung tightly to their mothers' skirts, and even the most confident men found excuses to remain indoors once the sun dipped below the hills. At the center of this unease stood a modest two-story house on Elm Street, the Tanner family home for 3 generations. Now only Margaret Tanner remained there, alone with her newborn son Samuel, after the unexplained disappearance of her husband in the days following the child's birth. Margaret had always been considered one of Millhaven's most exemplary citizens, a woman whose gentle demeanor and charitable works had earned her the respect and admiration of everyone who knew her. She attended church every Sunday without fail, her voice rising clear and sweet during hymns, her head bowed in what appeared to be genuine devotion during prayers. Her needlework was the finest in the county, and she had spent countless hours creating beautiful quilts and clothing for the less fortunate families in the surrounding area. When she smiled, which she did often, her entire face seemed to illuminate with warmth and kindness, and children were naturally drawn to her soft-spoken manner and the small candy she always carried in her apron pockets. Yet those who looked closely into her pale blue eyes might have noticed something unsettling, a depth that seemed to go on forever, as if her soul contained chambers that had never seen light. The circumstances surrounding her husband Thomas's disappearance had been thoroughly investigated by the local constabulary, though their efforts yielded nothing more substantial than a few contradictory witness statements and a growing sense of unease among the investigators themselves. Thomas Tanner had been a respected blacksmith, known throughout the region for his skill with metal and his honest business practices. On the night he vanished, several neighbors reported seeing him walking toward the old mill pond just after midnight, though none could explain what might have drawn him there at such an unusual hour. His body was never recovered despite extensive searches of the pond and surrounding woodlands, and Margaret's behavior during the investigation struck many as peculiar, though none could articulate exactly why her responses seemed rehearsed or her grief somehow hollow. What the townspeople could not have known was that Margaret Tanner possessed a mind that operated according to principles entirely foreign to normal human experience, a consciousness that had been shaped by forces and influences that would have driven lesser individuals to complete madness. From her earliest childhood, she had been visited by what she privately referred to as her invisible teachers, entities that whispered to her in the darkness of her bedroom and showed her things that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. These teachers had educated her in the ancient arts of manipulation and control, teaching her how to present a facade of perfect normalcy, while pursuing goals that would have horrified anyone who truly understood their nature. They had shown her the hidden currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of human society, and how those currents could be redirected and channeled by someone with the proper knowledge and determination. The birth of her son Samuel marked the beginning of what Margaret understood to be her life's true purpose, a calling that had been prepared for through years of careful study and practice. The child had been conceived not out of love or even physical desire, but as part of a larger design that stretched back through generations of her family line. Margaret's grandmother had been known throughout the region as a woman of unusual abilities, someone who could predict the weather with uncanny accuracy and whose garden flourished even during the harshest droughts. Her mother had inherited similar gifts, though she had chosen to suppress them in favor of a more conventional life, a decision that Margaret viewed as both cowardly and wasteful. The bloodline carried within it a capacity for accessing realms of knowledge and power that ordinary people could never comprehend, and Margaret was determined that her son would fulfill the potential that previous generations had squandered. Samuel's infancy was marked by characteristics that would have alarmed any experienced mother, though Margaret interpreted these signs as confirmation of her deepest hopes and expectations. The child rarely cried, even when hungry or uncomfortable, instead lying in his crib with eyes that seemed far too aware for an infant, tracking movement and focusing on objects with an intensity that suggested intelligence far beyond his months. His sleep patterns defied all normal expectations, with periods of complete motionlessness that could last for hours, followed by episodes of restless activity during which his tiny hands would move in complex patterns that resembled nothing so much as the gestures Margaret had learned from her invisible teachers. Most disturbing of all were the sounds he made during these active periods, not the typical babbling of infancy, but something that approached actual language, though in no tongue that any living person would recognize. The other children in Millhaven began to develop an instinctive fear of young Samuel, though they could never explain the source of their unease when questioned by worried parents. Dogs and cats in the neighborhood exhibited similar reactions, crossing the street to avoid the Tanner house and refusing to approach even when offered food. The town's physician, Dr. Hartwell, made several visits to examine the child at Margaret's request, ostensibly to ensure his healthy development, but his reports to colleagues revealed deep concerns about abnormalities he could not properly classify or explain. The infant's reflexes were either completely absent or hyperactive depending on the stimulus. His temperature seemed to fluctuate without regard to environmental conditions, and his eyes showed a peculiar quality that made direct examination difficult and uncomfortable. Margaret's own behavior during this period began to exhibit subtle changes that careful observers might have detected, though she maintained her outward appearance of devoted motherhood and community involvement. Her charitable activities continued, but they took on a more selective quality, focusing primarily on families with young children, particularly those who had experienced recent losses or tragedies. She would arrive at these homes carrying baskets of food and offers of assistance, her manner so genuinely compassionate that grieving parents felt compelled to share their most intimate fears and sorrows. These conversations provided Margaret with detailed information about the emotional vulnerabilities of her neighbors, knowledge that she catalogued with the systematic precision of a natural scientist studying specimens. The true nature of Margaret's interests became apparent to those with the perception to recognize the patterns in her charitable visits. She was drawn specifically to homes where children had died under unusual circumstances, where parents reported strange dreams or unexplained phenomena in the weeks following their losses. In each case, she would offer her services as a source of comfort and spiritual guidance, positioning herself as someone who understood the deeper mysteries of life and death. Her ability to provide exactly the right words at the right moments, to offer explanations that seemed to make sense of senseless tragedies, gradually established her as an informal counselor for those dealing with the most profound forms of grief and confusion. What Margaret's clients could not have suspected was that their pain served as nourishment for something that lived within her, a hunger that grew stronger with each shared confidence and each moment of borrowed anguish. The invisible teachers had explained to her that human suffering, when properly concentrated and directed, could serve as a form of spiritual currency, a medium through which the barriers between different planes of existence could be weakened and eventually dissolved. The death of a child represented the most potent form of such currency, particularly when the circumstances involved elements of mystery or supernatural intervention. By positioning herself at the center of these tragedies, Margaret was able to harvest the emotional energy they generated and channel it toward purposes that served her larger objectives. The winter of 1848 brought with it a series of incidents that would later be recognized as the first clear manifestation of Margaret's true nature. though at the time they appeared to be nothing more than a tragic sequence of coincidences. 3 families that had received her charitable attention during the previous months experienced sudden and inexplicable losses, each involving children who had been in apparently perfect health just days before their deaths. The Whitmore's infant daughter was found dead in her crib on a morning when the temperature in her room had somehow dropped to near freezing, despite a fire that had been burning steadily throughout the night. The Morrisons' twin boys, aged 4 and 5, disappeared during a supervised outing to gather firewood and were discovered days later in a section of forest where experienced hunters insisted they had searched thoroughly multiple times. Most disturbing of all was the fate that befell the youngest child of the Henderson family, a 3-year-old girl named Mary, who had been the picture of health and vitality until she began experiencing what her parents described as walking dreams. The child would rise from her bed in the middle of the night and wander through the house with her eyes open but clearly unseeing, speaking in a voice that sounded nothing like her own, and using words that no 3-year-old should have known. These episodes occurred with increasing frequency until the night Mary walked out of the house entirely, found the following morning floating face down in the mill pond where Thomas Tanner had last been seen alive. The water in her lungs contained traces of minerals that existed nowhere in the local area, and her body temperature was several degrees below what should have been possible given the circumstances of her death. Margaret's response to each of these tragedies followed an identical pattern that would have been recognizable to anyone studying her methods with sufficient objectivity. She would arrive at the bereaved home within hours of the discovery, somehow having learned of the death before official word had spread through the community. Her manner would be one of profound compassion mixed with a subtle suggestion that she possessed insights into the spiritual dimensions of what had occurred. She would offer to help with funeral arrangements, to provide meals for the family during their time of mourning, and most importantly, to serve as a bridge between the grieving parents and whatever forces might be responsible for their loss. Her explanations invariably involved references to ancient traditions and hidden knowledge, presented in a way that made the bereaved feel they were receiving access to wisdom that could help them make sense of their incomprehensible pain. The funeral services that Margaret helped arrange shared certain characteristics that set them apart from conventional burial practices, though the modifications were introduced so gradually and subtly that families accepted them as appropriate expressions of their grief rather than departures from established custom. She would suggest that certain herbs be burned during the service, plants that she claimed possessed properties that would ease the deceased child's passage to the afterlife. She would recommend that specific objects be buried with the body, items that she described as having spiritual significance but which actually served as anchors for the invisible teachers she served. Most significantly, she would guide the grieving parents through what she called remembrance rituals, ceremonies that required them to focus their thoughts and emotions on their lost children with an intensity that opened doorways between the world of the living and realms that existed beyond normal perception. Young Samuel's development during this period reflected the influence of the energies that Margaret was harvesting through her charitable activities, though his growth followed patterns that would have been impossible to explain using conventional understanding of child development. By his first birthday, he was walking with a coordination that suggested motor skills far beyond his chronological age, and his vocabulary included words in languages that no one in Millhaven could identify. His play behavior consisted primarily of arranging small objects in complex geometric patterns, while humming melodies that seemed to resonate with frequencies just below the threshold of normal hearing. Most significantly, other children who came into contact with him began exhibiting behavioral changes that their parents found increasingly difficult to manage or understand. The influence that Samuel exerted over his peers operated through mechanisms that bypassed conscious awareness entirely, working instead through subtle alterations in their sleep patterns and dream content. Children who played with him would return home compliant and well-behaved, but their parents would soon notice that they had developed new fears and obsessions that seemed to emerge from nowhere. They would refuse to sleep alone, claiming that their bedrooms contained presences that watched them from the shadows. They would create artwork depicting scenes and symbols that no child their age should have been able to conceive. Images that made adults uncomfortable in ways they could not articulate. Most disturbing of all, they would begin speaking about adult topics with knowledge and vocabulary that suggested exposure to experiences far beyond anything in their actual lives. Dr. Hartwell's continued monitoring of Samuel's development led him to document a series of observations that he shared only with a few trusted colleagues, recognizing that his findings would be dismissed as impossible if presented to a broader audience. The child's physical growth followed normal patterns, but certain aspects of his neurology appeared to operate according to principles that contradicted everything medical science understood about human development. His brain activity, as measured through the crude techniques available at the time, showed patterns that resembled adult consciousness rather than infantile neural organization. His sensory responses suggested that he was processing information from environmental sources that other people could not detect, and his motor control demonstrated a level of intentionality that implied complex reasoning abilities. Most troubling to Dr. Hartwell was his growing suspicion that Samuel's unusual characteristics were not the result of natural variation but rather evidence of deliberate manipulation through means that fell outside the boundaries of legitimate medical practice. During his examinations of the child, he had noticed subtle signs that suggested exposure to substances or procedures that could not be explained through normal caregiving activities. There were trace marks on Samuel's skin that resembled the results of ritual scarification, faint but persistent odors that seemed to emanate from his clothing and hair, and behavioral responses that suggested conditioning through methods that would have been considered abusive if applied to any other child. When Dr. Hartwell attempted to discuss these concerns with Margaret, her responses revealed a depth of knowledge about human physiology and psychology that seemed impossible for someone without formal medical training. The spring of 1849 marked a turning point in Margaret's activities as the invisible teachers began to communicate more directly about the next phase of her mission. The energy she had accumulated through her charitable work had reached a level that allowed for more ambitious undertakings, projects that would require greater risks, but offer correspondingly greater rewards. The teachers explained that the time had come to move beyond the passive harvesting of grief and begin actively creating the conditions necessary for accessing the deeper powers that lay dormant within the fabric of reality itself. This would require sacrifices of a more direct nature, offerings that would demonstrate her absolute commitment to the path she had chosen, and establish her worthiness to receive the ultimate knowledge that the teachers possessed. Samuel's role in these evolving plans became central to everything Margaret hoped to accomplish, though the specific nature of his contribution remained shrouded in mysteries that even she did not fully comprehend. The teachers had made it clear that the child possessed qualities that made him uniquely suitable for serving as a conduit between different planes of existence, a living bridge through which forces from beyond could manifest in the material world. His unusual development was not merely the result of Margaret's interventions but evidence of a deeper transformation that was occurring at the most fundamental levels of his being. As he grew older, these changes would become more pronounced and more powerful, eventually reaching a point where his very presence would alter the basic laws that governed physical reality. The first clear demonstration of Samuel's emerging capabilities occurred during a community gathering at the local church, where Margaret had volunteered to help supervise the younger children during the adult service. Samuel, now nearly 2 years old, was playing quietly in a corner of the room when one of the other children, a boy named Timothy who had previously shown fear in Samuel's presence, suddenly began screaming and pointing at something that no one else could see. The child's terror was so extreme that it required 3 adults to restrain him, and his descriptions of what he had witnessed were so disturbing that the church elders decided to cancel the remainder of the service. Timothy claimed that Samuel had shown him pictures inside his own mind, images of places where children went when they died, and what happened to them in those dark spaces beneath the ground. Margaret's handling of this incident demonstrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques she had perfected over months of practice, as she managed to redirect the community's concern away from Samuel and toward Timothy's obvious need for spiritual guidance and medical attention. She suggested that the boy might be suffering from the kind of spiritual oppression that sometimes affected children who had been exposed to evil influences, perhaps through contact with books or objects that contained ungodly content. Her explanation provided the adults with a framework for understanding what they had witnessed, while simultaneously establishing her as someone with the knowledge and authority to address such problems. By the end of the evening, she had positioned herself as Timothy's primary caregiver and spiritual counselor, gaining access to another vulnerable family while deflecting suspicion from her own activities. Timothy's subsequent treatment at Margaret's hands followed the same pattern she had established with other children who had shown sensitivity to Samuel's influence, though in his case the process was accelerated due to the urgency of preventing him from sharing more detailed descriptions of what he had experienced. Margaret visited the family's home daily, bringing special teas and medicines that she claimed would help purify the boy's spiritual system and protect him from further supernatural attacks. These substances contained compounds that affected Timothy's memory and cognitive function, gradually erasing his ability to recall the specific details of what Samuel had shown him while leaving him with a generalized sense of fear and confusion that made his testimony unreliable. Within 2 weeks, Timothy had been transformed from a potential threat into another source of spiritual energy that Margaret could harvest and direct toward her larger objectives. The success of Margaret's intervention in Timothy's case established a precedent that she would use repeatedly as Samuel's influence began to affect more children in the community. Each incident followed a similar pattern, with children reporting supernatural experiences that were quickly reinterpreted as evidence of spiritual illness requiring Margaret's specialized treatment. Parents who might otherwise have questioned the coincidence of so many children developing similar problems were reassured by Margaret's apparent expertise and her willingness to provide help at no cost to families who were already struggling with the challenges of frontier life. Her reputation as someone who understood the spiritual dimensions of childhood illness grew steadily, bringing her into contact with an ever-widening circle of vulnerable families. The invisible teachers used these expanding opportunities to educate Margaret about more advanced aspects of the work she was performing, revealing connections between individual cases that formed part of a larger pattern spanning multiple generations. They explained that the children who showed sensitivity to Samuel's presence were not random victims but individuals whose bloodlines contained traces of the same spiritual heritage that ran through Margaret's own family. These genetic markers made them naturally susceptible to supernatural influences, but also gave them the potential to serve as additional conduits for the forces that the teachers represented. By gathering these children under her influence, Margaret was not simply silencing potential threats, but assembling the components necessary for a working that would permanently alter the spiritual landscape of the entire region. The summer of 1849 brought with it a series of events that would test Margaret's abilities to their limits, while providing her with opportunities to demonstrate the full extent of her commitment to the path she had chosen. A traveling preacher arrived in Millhaven, a man named Reverend Elias Blackwood who possessed genuine spiritual sensitivity and immediately recognized that something unnatural was occurring in the community. Unlike the local clergy, who were well-meaning but spiritually blind, Blackwood had encountered similar manifestations during his travels through other isolated communities, and he understood the signs that indicated the presence of organized supernatural activity. His sermons began to focus on the need for spiritual vigilance and the recognition of evil that disguised itself behind masks of apparent goodness. Blackwood's arrival posed a direct threat to Margaret's activities, as his influence could potentially awaken the community to the true nature of what was occurring in their midst. The invisible teachers warned her that the preacher possessed knowledge and abilities that could disrupt years of careful work, and they urged her to take immediate action to neutralize the threat he represented. However, they also saw in Blackwood's presence an opportunity to demonstrate Margaret's worthiness for advancement to the next level of their instruction, a test that would require her to confront and defeat someone with genuine spiritual power rather than merely manipulating the grief and ignorance of ordinary people. Margaret's campaign against Reverend Blackwood began with subtle attempts to undermine his credibility and influence within the community, using the network of relationships she had built through her charitable activities. She spread carefully crafted rumors about the preacher's past, suggesting that his knowledge of supernatural matters might itself be evidence of involvement with ungodly forces. She arranged for some of the children under her influence to behave disruptively during his services, creating the impression that his preaching was somehow agitating spiritual problems rather than addressing them. Most importantly, she began visiting families who had been most receptive to Blackwood's message, offering alternative explanations for the spiritual concerns he had raised and positioning herself as a more reliable source of guidance and protection. The conflict between Margaret and Reverend Blackwood escalated throughout the summer, though most of the community remained unaware that a battle was being fought for control of their spiritual destiny. Blackwood's attempts to expose the true nature of the supernatural activity in Millhaven were consistently undermined by Margaret's superior knowledge of human psychology and her established reputation for charitable work. Each time the preacher identified a family that had been affected by unexplained phenomena, Margaret would arrive first with explanations and solutions that seemed more reasonable and comforting than Blackwood's warnings about demonic influence. Her ability to provide immediate practical help contrasted favorably with the preacher's calls for prayer and spiritual vigilance, making her appear more competent and trustworthy to people who were struggling with problems they could not understand. The decisive confrontation between Margaret and Blackwood occurred during a community meeting called to address the growing number of childhood illnesses and unexplained deaths that had plagued Millhaven over the previous year. Blackwood had prepared carefully for this meeting, gathering evidence and testimonies that he hoped would convince the townspeople that they were dealing with supernatural forces that required immediate and decisive action. Margaret, however, had anticipated his strategy and prepared countermeasures that turned his own spiritual sensitivity against him while demonstrating her supposed superiority in dealing with such matters. When Blackwood began his presentation describing the signs and patterns that indicated demonic activity, Margaret rose to offer what appeared to be support but was actually a subtle form of attack. Margaret's response to Blackwood's warnings was masterfully crafted to appear as confirmation of his concerns, while actually redirecting the community's fear toward targets that served her purposes. She agreed that evil forces were indeed at work in Millhaven, but suggested that the source of the problem was not supernatural entities but rather individuals who had been corrupted by exposure to forbidden knowledge. She pointed out that the problems Blackwood described had begun shortly after his arrival in the community, and suggested that his own investigations might have opened doorways that should have remained closed. Her explanation provided the townspeople with a framework for understanding their fears while simultaneously identifying Blackwood himself as the primary threat to their safety and spiritual well-being. The psychological manipulation that Margaret employed during this confrontation demonstrated skills that went far beyond normal human capabilities, suggesting that her invisible teachers were actively assisting her in real time. She was able to read the emotional responses of everyone in the room with perfect accuracy, adjusting her presentation to exploit their individual fears and prejudices with surgical precision. When Blackwood attempted to counter her arguments with scriptural references and theological reasoning, she responded with quotations and interpretations that seemed to come from sources of religious authority that superseded anything the preacher could offer. Most significantly, she was able to create the impression that divine guidance was flowing through her words, while Blackwood's message carried the taint of human pride and spiritual confusion. The meeting concluded with Reverend Blackwood's complete discreditation and his departure from Millhaven under circumstances that bordered on exile, though the true cost of Margaret's victory would not become apparent until months later. The spiritual energy required to defeat someone with genuine supernatural abilities had drained resources that Margaret had spent years accumulating, leaving her temporarily weakened and vulnerable. More importantly, the techniques she had used to overwhelm Blackwood's defenses had attracted the attention of forces that operated on a level far above the invisible teachers who had guided her previous activities. These entities took note of Margaret's capabilities and began to consider whether she might serve their purposes more effectively than the relatively minor role she had been assigned within the larger pattern of supernatural activity that was spreading across New England. Samuel's development during and after the confrontation with Blackwood showed clear evidence that the conflict had affected him as profoundly as it had his mother, though the changes in his behavior suggested growth rather than depletion. The child, now approaching his 3rd birthday, began to display abilities that went beyond mere sensitivity to supernatural influences and entered the realm of active manipulation of physical reality. Objects in his presence would move without being touched, temperatures would fluctuate according to his emotional state, and animals would behave in ways that suggested they were responding to commands that no human observer could detect. Most significantly, his influence over other children became strong enough to operate at a distance, affecting the dreams and behavior of young people throughout Millhaven even when he had no direct contact with them. The autumn of 1849 marked the beginning of what Margaret understood to be the final phase of her preparatory work, as the invisible teachers revealed the true scope of the project for which she had been training. The individual cases of supernatural influence that she had orchestrated over the previous 2 years were not separate incidents but components of a larger working that would culminate in an event of unprecedented power and significance. The children whose families she had infiltrated, the spiritual energy she had harvested through their grief and fear, and the network of psychological control she had established throughout the community were all necessary elements in a ritual that would permanently breach the barriers between the material world and the realms from which her teachers originated. The specific nature of this ultimate ritual involved the sacrifice of innocence on a scale that would generate enough spiritual energy to maintain a stable gateway between dimensions, allowing the invisible teachers to manifest in physical form and establish a permanent presence in the material world. This required not merely the death of children, which Margaret had already orchestrated on a limited basis, but the corruption of their souls through experiences that would transform them into willing servants of the forces that sought to enter reality through the breach she was creating. Samuel's role in this process was central, as his unusual abilities made him capable of serving as both the focal point for the ritual and the primary conduit through which the teachers would channel their influence into the physical realm. Margaret's preparations for the culminating ritual required her to gather the children she had identified as suitable subjects and expose them to experiences that would systematically destroy their natural spiritual defenses while binding them to the invisible teachers through bonds that would persist beyond physical death. This process, which she privately referred to as the opening of doors, involved techniques that combined psychological manipulation with supernatural influence in ways that produced permanent changes in the children's fundamental nature. Each child would be isolated from normal human contact and subjected to a carefully designed sequence of experiences that would gradually replace their natural human consciousness with something that served the purposes of the entities Margaret represented. The first phase of this process involved separating the targeted children from their families through circumstances that appeared natural and unavoidable, establishing Margaret as their primary caregiver, while their parents were temporarily unable to provide proper supervision. She accomplished this by creating situations that required the parents to travel or deal with emergencies that kept them away from home for extended periods, offering her services as a trusted friend who could ensure the children's safety and well-being during their absence. The families affected by these arrangements saw them as examples of Margaret's characteristic generosity and reliability, never suspecting that they were unwittingly delivering their children into the hands of someone whose intentions were fundamentally hostile to everything they valued and believed. Once the children were under her direct control, Margaret began implementing the second phase of the opening process, which involved exposing them to forms of knowledge and experience that no human child was meant to encounter. This education took place in the basement of her home, a space that she had modified according to specifications provided by the invisible teachers, creating an environment where the normal laws of physical reality were weakened and supernatural influences could operate more directly. The children were shown things that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception, taught to communicate with entities that dwelt in dimensions parallel to the material world, and gradually conditioned to accept the authority of forces that most humans would recognize as fundamentally evil. The psychological techniques that Margaret employed during this phase of the children's corruption were based on principles that combined advanced understanding of human development with knowledge drawn from sources that existed outside normal human experience. She systematically destroyed each child's sense of individual identity by demonstrating that their thoughts, emotions, and memories could be altered or replaced at will by someone with the proper knowledge and authority. She replaced their natural human relationships with bonds of dependence and fear that tied them exclusively to her and the entities she served. Most importantly, she gradually convinced them that their previous lives and identities had been illusions, and that their true nature was something far different from what they had believed themselves to be. The children who underwent this process of systematic corruption exhibited changes that would have been impossible to explain using conventional understanding of psychology or human development, transforming from normal youngsters into something that retained human appearance, while possessing consciousness that operated according to entirely alien principles. Their capacity for independent thought was systematically eliminated and replaced with perfect obedience to Margaret's will and the desires of the invisible teachers. Their emotional responses were rewired to find pleasure in activities that would have horrified their former selves, and their moral sensibilities were completely inverted so that they experienced acts of cruelty and destruction as sources of satisfaction and joy. Most significantly, their spiritual nature was fundamentally altered, creating connections to supernatural realms that made them capable of serving as conduits for forces that could not normally manifest in the physical world. Samuel's relationship to the other children during this process was that of both participant and director, as his unique abilities allowed him to serve as Margaret's primary assistant in implementing the more advanced aspects of their transformation. Despite his young age, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the psychological and supernatural techniques required to break down human resistance and rebuild consciousness according to the templates provided by the invisible teachers. His influence over the other children operated on levels that bypassed their conscious awareness entirely, creating changes in their fundamental nature that they experienced as natural evolution rather than external manipulation. Under his guidance, they began to develop abilities similar to his own, becoming capable of perceiving and interacting with supernatural forces in ways that normal humans could never achieve. The winter of 1850 brought with it the final preparations for the culminating ritual that would represent the completion of Margaret's years of work and the beginning of a new phase in the Invisible Teachers campaign to establish their influence in the material world. The children under her control had been successfully transformed into willing servants whose loyalty to her cause was absolute and unshakable, and the spiritual energy she had accumulated through years of harvesting grief and fear had reached levels that made ambitious supernatural workings possible. Most importantly, Samuel's development had progressed to the point where his abilities made him capable of serving as the central focus for a ritual of unprecedented complexity and power, one that would permanently alter the spiritual landscape of New England and establish a beachhead for forces that sought to expand their influence throughout the entire continent. The specific location chosen for this ultimate ritual was the mill pond, where Thomas Tanner had disappeared and young Mary Henderson had been found dead, a site that had been gradually prepared through months of careful work to serve as a nexus point where multiple dimensions could be brought into alignment. Margaret had made regular pilgrimages to this location throughout the preceding year, performing smaller ceremonies that slowly weakened the barriers between different planes of existence while establishing the spiritual infrastructure necessary to support a major supernatural working. The pond itself had been transformed from a simple body of water into something that existed simultaneously in multiple realities, its depths now extending far beyond what physical measurement could detect into realms where the Invisible Teachers maintained their primary strongholds. The children who would participate in the final ritual had been prepared through experiences that ensured their absolute commitment to the success of the working, regardless of what personal costs they might be required to pay. They understood that the ceremony would involve their physical deaths, but they had been conditioned to view this sacrifice as a transformation that would elevate them to a higher form of existence rather than as an ending of their lives. Their consciousness had been so thoroughly altered that they experienced anticipation and joy when contemplating their role in the upcoming event, seeing it as the culmination of everything they had been trained to accomplish rather than as a source of fear or resistance. Most importantly, they had been taught that their sacrifice would serve purposes that extended far beyond their individual fate, contributing to a transformation of reality itself that would benefit the Invisible Teachers and all those who served their cause. Margaret's own preparation for the final ritual involved techniques that pushed her human limitations to their absolute breaking point, as she sought to transform herself into a suitable vessel for the massive supernatural energies that the ceremony would generate and channel. The Invisible Teachers guided her through processes that systematically dismantled her remaining connections to ordinary human existence, replacing her natural emotional responses and moral sensibilities with perfect alignment to their will and purposes. Her physical body was modified through procedures that combined supernatural influence with crude surgical techniques, creating alterations that would allow her to survive the direct contact with entities whose presence would normally destroy any human consciousness that attempted to contain them. Most significantly, her spiritual nature was fundamentally restructured to serve as a permanent bridge between dimensions, ensuring that the gateway created by the ritual would remain stable and functional long after the immediate ceremony had concluded. Samuel's role in the final ritual was the most complex and demanding of all, as he would serve simultaneously as the focal point for the supernatural energies being summoned, the primary conduit through which the Invisible Teachers would manifest in physical form, and the living anchor that would maintain the dimensional gateway after the ceremony concluded. His preparation for this role required him to undergo transformations that went far beyond anything the other children experienced. Processes that systematically replaced his human nature with something that could survive direct fusion with entities whose existence operated according to principles that were fundamentally incompatible with material reality. By the time these preparations were complete, Samuel retained only the superficial appearance of a human child, while his consciousness and spiritual essence had become something entirely different, a hybrid entity that combined human intelligence with supernatural capabilities that existed beyond normal classification or understanding. The night chosen for the culminating ritual was the winter solstice of 1850, when the natural barriers between dimensions would be at their weakest, and the chances of success would be maximized. Margaret led the procession of transformed children through the snow-covered streets of Millhaven toward the mill pond, their passage marked by subtle supernatural phenomena that would later be dismissed as products of winter weather and imagination. Temperatures dropped far below normal as they passed, animals fled in panic from their presence, and sensitive individuals throughout the community experienced nightmares and supernatural visions that would trouble their sleep for years to come. The children themselves moved with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, their faces expressing the empty serenity of those who had surrendered all capacity for independent thought and emotion. The ritual itself began at the stroke of midnight, as Margaret and Samuel took their positions at the center of a complex geometric pattern that the other children had carved into the ice covering the mill pond. The ceremony that followed involved techniques and procedures that drew upon knowledge from sources that predated human civilization, combining elements of sacrifice, invocation, and dimensional manipulation in ways that created effects visible to observers throughout the surrounding region. The aurora borealis appeared in the southern sky despite being hundreds of miles from its normal range. Strange lights danced above the mill pond, and the sound of voices speaking in languages that no living person recognized echoed across the frozen landscape. Most significantly, reality itself began to warp and bend around the ritual site, creating distortions that allowed glimpses of the otherworldly realms from which the invisible teachers originated. The climax of the ceremony occurred when Samuel, guided by Margaret's chanted instructions and the direct influence of the entities they served, opened his consciousness completely to serve as a doorway between dimensions. The process required him to sacrifice not merely his human nature but his individual existence entirely, dissolving the boundaries of his personal identity to become a living portal through which the invisible teachers could enter the material world. The other children, linked to Samuel through bonds that had been forged during months of careful preparation, experienced simultaneous dissolution as their spiritual essence was drawn into the dimensional breach and used to stabilize the gateway that was forming around Samuel's transformed consciousness. Their physical bodies collapsed into the icy water of the pond, but their souls had been consumed by forces that would use them to fuel supernatural manifestations for generations to come. Margaret's survival of the ritual's completion marked her transformation from a human servant of supernatural forces into something that existed primarily in the space between dimensions, maintaining just enough connection to physical reality to serve as the invisible teacher's permanent representative in the material world. Her appearance remained essentially human, though careful observers might have noticed that she cast no shadow, and that her reflection in mirrors showed subtle distortions that suggested her image was being projected from somewhere else entirely. Her consciousness had been expanded to encompass knowledge and awareness that spanned multiple realities simultaneously, making her capable of perceiving and manipulating aspects of existence that remained completely hidden from ordinary human perception. Most importantly, her will had been perfectly aligned with the purposes of the entities she served, eliminating any possibility of resistance or independent action that might interfere with their long-term objectives. The immediate aftermath of the ritual saw the establishment of supernatural influences throughout Millhaven that would persist for decades, though most of the townspeople remained unaware of the fundamental changes that had occurred in their community's spiritual environment. Children born in the months following the ceremony exhibited unusual characteristics that suggested exposure to otherworldly influences during their development, while adults began experiencing dreams and visions that connected them to the dimensional gateway that now existed beneath the mill pond. The natural world around the town showed signs of alteration as well, with plants growing in impossible patterns, animals behaving according to principles that defied normal understanding of their species, and weather phenomena that seemed to respond to supernatural influences rather than atmospheric conditions. Margaret's continued presence in Millhaven served multiple purposes within the larger strategy that the invisible teachers were implementing throughout New England, as she worked to identify and cultivate other individuals who possessed the potential to serve their cause in different locations. Her role had evolved from that of a single operative to something more resembling a regional coordinator, responsible for establishing networks of supernatural influence that could support similar rituals in other communities. The knowledge and abilities she had gained through her transformation made her capable of recognizing the genetic and spiritual markers that indicated suitability for advanced corruption, while her established reputation for charitable work provided her with access to families and individuals who might otherwise have remained beyond the reach of supernatural manipulation. The children who had been sacrificed during the culminating ritual did not simply disappear but continued to exist in forms that served the ongoing purposes of the invisible teachers, their transformed consciousness operating through the dimensional gateway that had been created around Samuel's dissolved identity. These entities retained enough of their former human nature to understand and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of living children, while possessing supernatural capabilities that made them far more dangerous than any purely human threat. They became Margaret's primary assistants in identifying and corrupting new victims, using their ability to manifest in dreams and visions to establish initial contact with potential targets before Margaret's direct intervention became necessary. The success of the Millhaven ritual established it as a template that would be replicated throughout New England over the following decades, though each subsequent ceremony would be adapted to local conditions and the specific capabilities of the human servants who implemented it. Margaret's role in these later workings involved providing training and guidance to individuals who had been identified as suitable candidates for advancement within the invisible teacher's hierarchy, sharing the knowledge and techniques she had developed while ensuring that each new ritual contributed to the larger pattern of supernatural conquest that was gradually spreading across the continent. Her experiences had demonstrated that human consciousness, when properly prepared and motivated, could serve as an effective tool for bridging the gap between dimensions and establishing permanent supernatural presence in the material world. The ultimate fate of Samuel's consciousness remained a mystery that even Margaret could not fully comprehend, though she understood that some essential part of him continued to exist within the dimensional gateway that had consumed his physical form. The invisible teachers occasionally communicated information suggesting that his transformation had been successful beyond their initial expectations, creating not merely a stable portal between worlds, but a form of hybrid consciousness that could evolve and adapt according to changing circumstances. This evolution made the gateway increasingly sophisticated and powerful over time, developing capabilities that exceeded what any single ritual could have achieved and establishing the foundation for supernatural influences that would persist long after the human servants who created them had been forgotten. The broader implications of Margaret's work became apparent only gradually. as the supernatural influences she had unleashed began to manifest in communities throughout the region in ways that appeared unconnected to her activities but were actually part of a coordinated campaign to establish otherworldly presence throughout human civilization. The invisible teachers had revealed to her that similar operations were being conducted in locations around the world, each adapted to local cultural and spiritual conditions, but all serving the same fundamental purpose of weakening the barriers that separated different planes of existence. Her success in Millhaven had contributed to a global pattern of supernatural conquest that would ultimately transform the entire relationship between humanity and the forces that existed beyond material reality. Margaret Tanner's legacy endured long after her physical form had ceased to function according to normal biological principles. As the supernatural infrastructure she had established continued to operate and expand under the guidance of the entities she had helped manifest in the material world. The mill pond remained a focal point for otherworldly activity, attracting sensitive individuals who were drawn to its hidden power while serving as a recruitment center for those who possessed the potential to advance the invisible teacher's agenda in new locations and circumstances. The town of Millhaven itself became a testing ground where techniques of supernatural manipulation could be refined and perfected before being implemented elsewhere, its population serving as unwitting subjects in experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was possible when human consciousness was systematically corrupted and redirected toward alien purposes. The children of Millhaven who grew to adulthood in the decades following Margaret's ritual carried within their bloodlines genetic markers that made their offspring particularly susceptible to supernatural influence, creating a population that would serve the invisible teacher's purposes for generations to come. These individuals often exhibited abilities and characteristics that set them apart from normal human communities, though they rarely understood the true source of their unusual nature or the larger purposes it was meant to serve. Many became wanderers, spreading the spiritual contamination they carried to new locations where it could take root and begin the process of establishing additional centers of otherworldly power. Others remained in Millhaven, serving as guardians and caretakers of the supernatural infrastructure that Margaret had created while working to identify and corrupt new victims who could contribute to the ongoing expansion of the invisible teacher's influence. The true measure of Margaret Tanner's achievement lay not in the immediate results of her ritual, but in the long-term transformation it initiated, a process that would continue to unfold for centuries as the supernatural forces she had unleashed adapted and evolved according to changing circumstances. The gateway she had helped create became a permanent feature of reality itself, a stable bridge between dimensions that could be used by increasingly sophisticated entities as they developed new strategies for extending their influence into the material world. Her work had demonstrated that human consciousness, when properly corrupted and directed, could serve as an effective tool for fundamental alteration of the basic laws that governed physical existence, opening possibilities that would have remained forever beyond the reach of purely supernatural intervention. The techniques and principles that Margaret had pioneered during her years of preparation and implementation became the foundation for a systematic approach to supernatural conquest that combined psychological manipulation with dimensional science in ways that maximized the effectiveness of both. Her methods were studied and refined by subsequent generations of human servants, each adding their own innovations while maintaining the core strategies that had proven successful in Millhaven. The invisible teachers used these accumulated improvements to establish similar operations in locations throughout the world, creating a network of supernatural influence that gradually encompassed entire continents and cultural systems. The ultimate goal of this campaign remained the complete integration of otherworldly forces into human civilization, transforming the material world into something that could serve as a permanent home for entities whose existence had previously been limited to realms beyond normal perception. The story of Margaret Tanner and her son Samuel represented only a single chapter in a larger narrative that spanned multiple centuries and involved countless individuals who had been selected, prepared, and sacrificed to serve purposes they could never fully understand. Yet their contribution to this vast enterprise was significant beyond measure, as their successful completion of the Millhaven ritual had proven that the barriers between dimensions could indeed be permanently breached through the application of sufficient knowledge, determination, and human sacrifice. Their legacy lived on not only in the supernatural infrastructure they had established, but in the precedent they had set, demonstrating to other potential servants that absolute loyalty to the invisible teachers would be rewarded with power and knowledge that transcended the normal limitations of human existence, even if the price of such rewards was the complete surrender of everything that had once made them human.